Hello and welcome to the Career Services presentation on resumes, presented by Northern Kentucky University. Let's start with the basics. What is a resume? A resume is a summary of your background, competencies, and accomplishments. This is often used by employers or universities to assess your qualifications for positions, scholarships, admission, etc. Often people ask, what is the goal of a resume? For an employment resume, you may be thinking that the goal is to land that job. But in reality, the goal of the resume and the purpose of the resume is to get you an interview. Every job out there is going to want to meet you before they extend you an offer. So the resume is a way to get your foot in the door so that you can meet them in person or through video or phone interviews so that then they can further assess whether you're the right fit for that position. A question we often get is, how long should my resume be? For most students, 1 page is going to be sufficient, but we do accept that you may have 2 pages if you have a lot of experience. It is rarely recommended that you go beyond 2 pages, so we would love to help you get that resume down to just 1 page or 2 pages. So some additional purposes of a resume are to give an employer an idea of who you are and what you can do to meet that employer's needs. A well-organized resume can create a positive first impression for that employer. And it also helps to remind them of who you are after they meet you at an interview or at a career fair so that they can remember all the details of your experiences. It's also a way for HR officials or human resources officials to introduce you and your background to others who are making the hiring decision. When thinking about starting creating a resume, it's great to make a list of all the possible things that you might want to include. We recommend that you make a list of everything you might include and then edit that down to a smaller list as you start really creating it. Some students like to create an outline to get started with organizing before they actually focus on the resume formatting. You'll want to see the example resumes at the end of the resume preparation guide that's available on our website. You do want to avoid using a template. A lot of times when students are creating a resume for the first time, they're tempted to use a template from Google or from Word, but these are not the best way for you to approach your resume. So you want to avoid selecting a resume template. There are different types of resumes you can choose from based on your experience. A chronological style resume is by far the most common and focuses on putting your work experience in reverse chronological order. So that means your most recent experiences first and your oldest experiences last. Some students will find a functional resume more helpful because this focuses on relevant skill sets and can minimize your chronological work history. And some students like to make a combination, so putting together elements of a chronological style resume and a functional style resume to find the fit that best highlights your experiences. Because most people use a chronological style resume, this will be the focus of the presentation. But if you have interest in learning more about functional or combination style resumes, let us know in Career Services and we'd be glad to meet with you and talk in more detail. There are some basic building blocks that are included on every resume. Those are your contact information, your educational background, and your experience. There are some additional optional headings here that you should choose from based on your experience and the type of position that you're applying for. Some of those may be an objective, related experience or professional experience, military experience, activities and student organizations, leadership, internship and co-op experiences, skills, honors, volunteering, professional affiliations, etc. So you should spend some time reflecting on your unique skills and experiences so that you can come up with headings and other organizational attributes that will fit your experience and really help your resume stand out. When thinking about that contact information section, you can use both your current and your permanent address. So if you're living somewhere now, but you know that it's not permanent and you know that you'll be moving, you may want to also include a permanent address. You definitely want to make sure that you're consistent with abbreviations. So if you abbreviate the state in your current address, you'll want to be sure to abbreviate the state in your permanent address as well. You'll always want to make sure to include your email address and your phone number. And you want to make sure that email address is appropriate. Your NKU email address is typically fine as long as you're checking it regularly, but you could also use a personal email address as well as long as it's not something inappropriate for employers. Next, you'll want to list your education section. You definitely want to list your post-secondary institution, the location, the degree that you earned, and your graduation date, or the degree that you are currently working on. You'll want to include your majors and your minors, however many of those you may have, as well as your GPA. We recommend that your GPA be listed on your resume if it's a 3.0 or above. If it's below a 3.0, you can just leave that off. If your major GPA is higher than your overall GPA, you could list your major GPA as a way to highlight how well you've done in those courses. If you have study abroad experiences or academic honors, or really any honors related to your major, those are great to list in your education section as well. And you may also want to list some related coursework, especially if you have taken unique courses that are unexpected for your major, but related to the position, then that would be great to list. Or if you want to highlight that you've taken a specific course in your major, that you've already completed it because you know it's related to that job, then that can go well in that section. You should see the examples for more information. Here are a couple of examples of ways that students could list their education on their resume. So you see in the first example, it lists Northern Kentucky University, Highland Heights, Kentucky, Bachelor of Science in Sociology. This is a May 2020 graduation date. You see that this student included Society, Environment, and Technology track. So if you have a track, you could certainly list that. And the student also has a minor in Popular Culture Studies listed. If you have a minor, I would certainly recommend that you list that on your resume. Because this student's GPA is a 3.6, they have decided to list that in the education section as well. Now you'll see in the second example, the student chose to list Bachelor of Arts first, expected December 2020, and then has listed their major and minor on the next line, followed by Northern Kentucky University. Again, this student has a good GPA, and so they've listed that 3.7 as a bullet point in the education section. Either of these formats is perfectly fine, so you should find a format that fits your resume and fits your personal preferences. Here's another example that also includes some related courses. So you see that in the related courses, they've listed the name of the course. It's not necessary to list the course number, such as BUS 372, but the name of the course is relevant and understandable to employers who may not be as familiar with unique individual courses. Once you've got your education section, it's time to look at that experience section. It's important to list the name and location of each employer, whether that's a paid experience or an unpaid experience. Anything that teaches you relevant skills can be listed in your experience section. You'll want to list your job title and the dates, and then a description of the work that you did and the things that you learned in that role. You'll want to start those bullet points with action verbs. So if that job is current, you'll want to use a present tense verb. And if that job is in the past, you'll want to use a past tense verb. And we have some examples to show you. You want to focus not necessarily on what that job is, but specifically on your responsibilities, accomplishments, and skills. And again, these are listed in reverse chronological order. So if you have a job now, that job would be listed first, and then the previous position you had would be listed next, on down to the oldest position that you include on your resume. So here's an example of an experience as a sales associate at Dillard's. So you see that the format is that they've listed the company name, Dillard's, the city and state, Crestview Hills, Kentucky, their title, sales associate in the juniors department, and then the dates. It's recommended that you list the months and years of employment, not the specific date. So often people will list something like May 2019 to February 2020. Or if you have a seasonal position, then it makes sense to list something like summers 2018 and 19, or seasonal 2018 through 2020. So whatever makes sense for your experience there, but you want it to be really easy to understand for the employers. So then you see that this person has some bullet points that describe their experiences working at Dillard's. Promoted from stock clerk after 6 weeks, assisted customers in selecting merchandise and making purchases, prepared daily sales summaries and monthly reports, and trained, scheduled, and supervised 3 stock clerks. This is not necessarily the only thing that this person did as a sales associate, but these are the most relevant and most interesting things that they wanted to highlight that are related to the position that this student is applying for next. You'll see that the positions is also described in past tense, promoted, assisted, prepared, because this job is in the past and is no longer current. It's important to use bullet points. Employers in all industries tell us that they prefer bullet points over paragraph format. You see that that is used in the example here. And you also want to be sure to start those bullet points with action verbs: promoted, assisted, prepared, trained. There's no need to use the word I as a subject. That is implied. You can just go ahead and start with the verb. Here are some examples of other action verbs: achieved, handled, completed, presented, utilized, generated. The resume preparation guide has a much longer list of action verbs that may give you some ideas on how to describe your experiences. You want to make sure to use a variety of action verbs so that it's enjoyable to read your resume and doesn't feel repetitive. Here's another experience example. These two examples represent the same job, but are described in different ways. So you'll see in the first listing, the server described their experience as took customers' orders, served food and beverages, bussed tables, and delivered personalized customer service and conveyed knowledge of menu. While that's an accurate description of what a server at the Olive Garden does, it doesn't really give you a sense of anything unique about that experience for this particular person. So you'll see in the second example that they still provided an overview of what that role involved: delivered personalized customer service while taking detailed food and drink orders, but also called out some specific skills that they developed and experiences that they had in that role. Built rapport with a diverse group of fellow employees. That shows some skills that that individual possesses from that role that will be applicable to any position that they're applying for in the future. Another example is selected by management to serve at special corporate event in August 2014 and key holder. These demonstrate a special level of responsibility and that this person really excelled in this role. And then the final bullet point, worked 35 hours per week while maintaining full course load. This demonstrates that this student has good time management skills. If you remember, maybe their GPA was really strong. So this shows a lot of skills about this individual student that may not be directly related to their work as a server, but more related to who they are as a full, well-rounded person who was working and also a student at the same time. Some students like to have a related experience section. So this gives you a chance to really call out different types of experiences, even if they may not be the most current. So you'll see that listing the related experience as a separate section allows you to put more related things first instead of focusing on what's in order. So in a traditional experience section, you would list all of your jobs from most recent to least recent. So you see here in this example, this person has been working at Applebee's for quite some time, but had more relevant experience to their job search previously as an archival processing intern and as a legal clerk and assistant. Well, if you have your resume listed like this, then an employer might read your server at Applebee's role and think that all of your experience is going to be unrelated to your history and attorney job search. But if instead you have your resume listed separating the related experience from your other work experience, then that allows you to really highlight that archival processing intern and legal clerk and assistant role, while then still providing additional information about your other work experience, like the server at Applebee's. So thinking about your own experience, I want you to consider whether a related experience and an other experience section would make sense for you, or if it makes more sense to keep all of your experience in one section. Some other subjects that you might want to include are a career and job objective, honors and activities, computer skills, and languages. Employers tell us that they especially want to see leadership roles and long-term activities in the honors and activities area, but not too many. I know I've seen a few student resumes where they have so many activities, it's overwhelming to me as a reader and loses focus. So So you may want to trim your list to make sure that it's really highlighting just what you want to highlight. There are a few things you do not need to include. You do not need to include any street addresses for the places that you've worked or the zip codes or phone numbers for those employers. You may be asked for this information on a job application, but you do not need to include those details on your resume. The same goes for the supervisor's name. Unless you're working for someone who's extremely famous and well-known in your field, there's no need to list that person's name on your resume. You may also see resume examples that have a phrase that says something like interests include, and people will list photography or soccer, or whatever their interests are. This is outdated and no longer needs to be included on your resume. Additionally, you do not need to list your references on your resume or the phrase references available upon request. Neither of those need to be included on your resume. Employers know they can request your references if they want them, and that should be submitted as a separate document. In thinking about those references, it is a good idea if you're developing your resume to go ahead and make sure that you have some references that you could include if you are asked. Ideally, these should be professional references, not people who know you personally necessarily, but people who know you professionally, unless you've been specifically asked for a personal or a character reference. You want to make sure to ask those individuals if they will agree to be your reference before you provide their name to anyone. Some people do not feel comfortable serving as a reference, and so you would not want to put them into an awkward position. It's good to make sure that you send a copy of your resume to any of your references. Individuals who are your reference often know you from one aspect of your life. Maybe they're your manager at your job, but they may not know about you in other aspects of your life, such as your educational endeavors and your student organizations or community involvement. So it's nice to give them a copy of your resume so that they know more about who you are as a well-rounded student and to help remind them of the things that you are specifically trying to highlight through this resume. When you accept a position, it's great to make sure to inform your references so that they know that they don't need to keep waiting for a call or a letter, and to thank them for their assistance. We do have an example references sheet in the resume preparation guide, but essentially use the same header as your resume and then list the individual people who have agreed to be your references, as well as some contact and personal information for them. So here's an example of a student, Emily Albright, and her references page. So you see that it's got her header from her resume, but then also the individual references that she's listed. So you'll typically list their name, their title, where you could mail them something, and then their phone number and email address. So you see that that example is carried through on each of them. So once you've got the meat and potatoes listed on your resume, it's good to go through and think about really editing that content. You want to go through and make sure that you're editing carefully, especially if you find yourself in a situation where your resume is too long and you want to shorten it. It's really important to think about what most positively reflects your qualifications and also what is most relevant to the position that you're applying for. You want to make sure to be consistent with your present and past tense verbs, so that within each section, it's easy to read and easy to understand. And you want to avoid using any acronyms that would not make sense to someone outside of that organization. So if you are working at a company that uses a lot of acronyms, or even in your education, if you have a lot of acronyms, you want to make sure to write those things out in a way that would make sense to anyone who may be reviewing your resume. In thinking about the overall layout, you want to check for a lot of consistency. So you'll want to make sure to check capitalization, abbreviations of things like states and street and avenue, bold facing, indentation, underlining. You just want to make sure that you're using all of that formatting consistently. You don't want to use too much bold or too much italics or too much underlining, just little bits to highlight maybe the headers, highlight one thing in each section. You don't want to use too much of that or it becomes overwhelming and less pleasant to read and less easy to read. And then you want to make sure to balance the material on your page and use some white space effectively. Sometimes when a student has a resume that's too long, they'll just cram more and more text onto each line and shrink the spaces between them, but that makes your eyes tired when you're reading. And again, you want it to be easy for employers to read. So we recommend that you use some white space effectively on your page to keep a balance between where there's text and where there's not text. In thinking about your format, you want to make sure to use a traditional, easy-to-read font, Arial, Times New Roman, Calibri, whatever font feels true to you, but also stick with something pretty traditional and something that you know that that employer will have on their computer so that they don't have formatting issues if they don't have the font. You want to stick to a font size between 10 and 12 point. You want it to be easy to read if you print it or if you're looking at it online. And you want to make sure to keep your margins wide enough that employers could print your page, especially if an employer is passing your resume around to multiple people, they're likely to print that so that they can write their notes on it. So you want to make sure that your margins are at least half an inch. Any narrower than that and they may have trouble printing. You want to be sure, above all else, that your resume has 0 errors. So Career Services offers to review your resume by emailing it to resumehelp@nku.edu. So we'd be glad to look it over and check for errors, check for formatting, but we'll also make recommendations if there are ways that we can change your wording to make it more effective or better highlight your experiences. This concludes the resume presentation. If you have any questions, please contact Career Services, and we'd be glad to help. Thank you.